We've got two knights of the realm here. So Simon Jenkins, columnist for The Guardian, former editor of The Times and The Evening Standard, and Dr. Charlotte Proudman, human rights barrister, who's the director of Right to Equality. 0345 6060 973.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 8 o'clock. In the last few minutes, the Prime Minister's controversial Rwanda deportation plan has suffered its first defeat in the House of Lords. Peers have voted in favour of an unprecedented move to delay a treaty with the East African nation. They've backed it by 214 votes to 171. A public health expert has told LBC it's worse to be poor in Britain than in other European countries. Professor of Epidemiology and Public Health Sir Michael Marmot has been reacting to a large rise in diseases common in the Victorian era.
Britain has become a poor country with a few rich people. Poor people in Britain have a lower income than Slovenia. It really is bad to be poor in Britain.
Our analysis revealed tens of thousands of people in the UK have been diagnosed with conditions such as malnutrition, rickets and scurvy. Ministers say they're determined to support people to have a healthy and balanced diet. 2 people have died and tens of thousands of buildings are without power after Storm Isha brought 100-mile-per-hour winds. Another storm is on the way tomorrow, with rail services already cancelled in Scotland. In the city, the FTSE 100 has closed up 25 points at 74.87. The pound buys $1.27 and €1.16. LBC weather: showers in the far north of England and northwestern Scotland overnight, clear elsewhere with lows of 2. A wet and windy start for the west tomorrow, starting bright in the east before becoming cloudy with heavy rain, highs of 14. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Charlotte Morgan.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello, a very good evening and welcome to Monday's Cross Question. Of course, you can watch our proceedings on Global Player if you'd like to, because you'll see the 4 beautiful faces that we have for you this evening, and the beautiful brains, impressive brains, rather beautiful maybe. Daisy Cooper is Liberal Democrat Deputy Leader. She's MP for St Albans. Sir Robert Buckland, KC, is Conservative MP for Swindon South and a former Justice Secretary. Sir Simon Jenkins is a columnist for The Guardian, also former editor of The Times and Evening Standard, and Dr. Charlotte Proudman is a human rights barrister who's the director of Right to Equality, an organisation seeking to remove sexist inequalities from the law. There's so many things that you could phone in about. We've actually nearly got a full switchboard already, so it's a couple of spaces free. 0345 6060 973. You can text 84850, or you can say, Alexa, send a comment to LBC. And as I say, do watch us on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Right, let's go to our first caller. It's James in Chelsea. James, very good evening.
Good evening, and good evening, panel. I just want to ask the question, how embarrassing is it for the British government to have the Rwandan deportation plans delayed by the House of Lords?
Well, in the last few minutes, peers have voted to say the government should not sign its agreement with Rwanda into law until the government can show that the improved protections for asylum seekers who are sent to Rwanda have actually been delivered by the Kigali government. Robert Buckland, now you were, of course, a member of the government that first promoted this. Are you fully behind it?
Well, I wasn't actually, but I am.
You were?
No, not in 2022. That was my first time out. I'd finished in 21 as Justice Secretary, and I came back to the Cabinet in the July after the announcement. But I think the principle of using third countries is neither immoral nor illegal. The point the Lords are making is echoes one I was making last week, actually, in a debate where I tabled an amendment suggesting that we shouldn't bring in this bill into law until we were satisfied that Rwanda had done everything that they said they were going to do in the treaty, which is improve the appeals process, improve the judicial process, and bring it up to a level that would no longer cause courts in this country the sort of concerns that we saw in the Supreme Court case in November. So I understand the logic of the Lords tonight. I think that it would be wise for everybody to make sure that Rwanda's done what it says it's going to do before we use this law.
Isn't there a risk at some point the Rwandans are just going to say, you know what, this is so insulting to us, we're not going to do it anymore? Would you heave a sigh of relief if they did?
Well, I think there is a risk. I heard the president last week saying that he'd give the money back. They're clearly worried that if we are too gung-ho and too keen on trying to break all the legal crockery in the dresser, that they will walk away. And, I think that would be quite an embarrassing moment for the government. Look, they've chosen this path. I'm not against using third countries. Other European countries are looking at the same way of doing things. The Italians and the Albanians are doing something not quite the same, but not dissimilar. And therefore, it's right that we try and come up with innovative solutions, and everybody who's, hectoring us on the sidelines keeps on coming up with very little, really, in terms of how to deal with what is a problem that is confronting the entire West.
Charlotte Proudman.
I mean, I am against using Rwanda as...
You astonish me.
I think that we have a moral and legal obligation and duty to provide a safe haven, asylum or refugee status for those that have a well-founded fear of persecution. And I think removing people to Rwanda is nothing more than in violation, potentially, of their human rights. And I think it sends out a really poor message in respect of our government and how little we value the lives of others. And, we're not just talking... A lot of the images tend to show these lone, single men that are being returned to Rwanda. It potentially includes those who may be at risk of female genital mutilation, who have experienced a huge amount of trauma, pain, distress, and have come to this country to protect themselves, potentially also their children, and are then taken to another country, this third country of Rwanda, where those women and girls in their own countries are not necessarily protected. It's a huge rate of violence against women and girls in Rwanda.
I have a feeling, and maybe Robert, or Daisy, you know the answer to this, that haven't the government said that they are only going to send men to Rwanda?
They've certainly created an exception in this bill for cases where you've got the most vulnerable people, so people who might be pregnant or terminally ill. I can think of, FGM victims, victims of abuse as fitting that category potentially. I think, individual cases absolutely need to be an exception here. If we'd followed some of the amendments some of my colleagues wanted to do to not allow any appeal or anything, that would have, I think, really cut right through the rule of law and all the principles that we're supposed to be defending.
Well, you and I,
trampling on.
Robert, you and I both know how chaotic the Home Office is and how else they're supposed to look at individual cases on their merit. Often, given there's a hostile immigration environment, whether you agree or disagree with that, we often tend to see that in the courts play out. We see examples of women slipping through the net, also children slipping through the net, who have been here years waiting for their asylum claims to be determined. I wouldn't be surprised if you see women at risk of FGM, sex trafficking, even rape, being sent to countries like Rwanda, where there is even potentially a higher risk of suffering violence against women and girls. What
about the progress of this through the House of Lords? I mean, this wasn't the bill that they were voting on tonight. This was a Labour
amendment.
Sort of amendment somehow. But do you think the House of Lords has the right to stand in the way of this bill?
Well, I think that's a very complex, constitutional question. I mean, I think they do have the right to stand in the way of this, as they have done previously. I mean, I remember even when it came to looking at the domestic abuse bill, something that I was involved in. I know that Robert was and did some extremely good work on that as well. When it was passing through the House of Lords, they made some, I think, really important amendments and called for votes on things like judicial training on domestic abuse. So I do think they have a really important role to scrutinise the bill properly and make sure that valid amendments are put forward.
But to actually stop it?
Yeah, I do. I do think that they have.
Daisy?
Well, overall on that specific question...
No, on the question that James asked.
Is it embarrassing? Of course it's embarrassing. It's incredibly embarrassing for the government, but it's not unexpected. I mean, many of us, including the Liberal Democrats, have been saying for a very long time, this plan is unworkable, it's incredibly expensive, it's immoral, and in its current form, it has been found to be illegal. The fact is that the government has spent millions and millions and millions of pounds on this scheme, and not one single person has been put on a flight to get to Rwanda. If they'd spent that money money on investing in the Home Office, on getting people in place to process the claims and get the backlog
they
down.
Have been doing
that would be come on. If they spent millions on this Rwanda scheme that they could have spent on getting the backlog down, and they haven't got the backlog down because when Rishi Sunak claimed that he'd cleared the backlog, the Liberal Democrats complained to the official statistics body, who responded and absolutely slammed Rishi Sunak for saying that, saying actually that's not factually correct. Well, standards in public life, is that too much to expect?
I suppose it depends on the definition of the backlog, doesn't it?
Precisely, but the backlog he claimed to have cleared, he was slapped down by the official statistics body, saying it was not an appropriate use of statistics and could undermine public trust.
But what's your view on the House of Lords' role in this? Because it wasn't in the Conservative Party manifesto, so you could argue that, well, there is no electoral mandate for it. Mm-hmm. But the House of Lords' primary responsibility is to scrutinise and to warn. But, I mean, a major bill like this, which the government seems to think is the most important thing ever, do they have the constitutional right to actually stop it?
So there are mechanisms in place. There are constitutional mechanisms in place for the House of Lords to express their opposition in the strongest terms, and that includes mechanisms like fatal motions and reasoned amendments, which say these are all the reasons why we disagree with this bill, and if members of the House of Lords want to vote for that, then they have the right to vote for it, to block the bill. That is a constitutional reality. As you say, this wasn't in the Conservatives' manifesto. Most of the time the House of Lords is a revising chamber, but I can tell you the Liberal Democrats are appalled by this bill. As I say, it's unworkable, it's expensive, it's immoral, and we will certainly be, expressing in the strongest terms our opposition to it.
And you have a lot of peers, don't you? Was it over 100?
Something like that, yeah.
So, you have a real influence in the House of Lords. Simon Jenkins.
Well, I've got all kinds of problems with the concept of dumping people in other countries who are inconvenient in our own country. I don't agree that the House of Lords has no right to do it. The House of Lords has a constitutional right to delay legislation, and it's there. It's in the law. I think the House of Lords is a nonsense. I think it's ridiculous that particular group of people, ludicrously overrepresented by the Liberal Democrats, can exercise parliamentary power in that way, but it is their right, and if they choose to do so, that's fine.
And they normally do it quite well.
Yeah, they are. There's some very good people in among the dross. But I mean, the thing that is never discussed, and we haven't discussed it, is it actually going to work in any sense? The bill is entirely about a concept called deterrence. And if there's one judicial concept, Robert may disagree, which has absolutely almost no validity, it's the idea of deterrence. If deterrence ever worked, no one would take drugs, no one would kill anybody, no one would commit anything. It is a very, very bad concept of justice. And this entire bill is based on the theory that people are going to stop coming in those boats because they might be deterred by going to Rwanda. It is a nonsense. And I think it's quite sad because almost all prime ministers, I was studying this, almost all prime ministers have a great mistake. I mean, they always end in some sort of failure. Cameron, Brexit, Ted Heath's incomes policy, is a mess. His is going to be Rwanda. And he must have known from the start, he's an intelligent man, this is a very, very bad policy. And yet he's hung on it.
Why has he done that, Robert?
Well, I think that, like all leaders in the Western world, he's under huge pressure to deal with the question of migration. And this issue of illegal or migration, which is one description for it, asylum seeking is the other, is a subset of a subset of a subset of a policy that we have now focused upon. I think that sometimes in politics, you don't actually have the luxury of choice. I think that he felt that the principle of using a third country was right, and the court itself said there was no issue with that. There really isn't an issue. And I think that, to criticise the policy and to say we wouldn't support it even if it worked, I think is really a negative.
But the point that Simon was making about deterrence, I mean, that is right, isn't it?
Look, having been, criminal barrister, whatever, for years, I've always been more persuaded by public protection as the function of stiff sentencing. Deterrence, I've not been that persuaded. I think there are a couple of examples of types of offence where you can make an example and deter others, but they are vanishingly few. And I think rather than going on about the deterrence principle, I think the principle of getting a third country to help is perfectly unobjectionable. Now, whether Rwanda is the right one is a legitimate question to ask. And that's why I think, Simon couching the questions he does about will it work, that seems to me the key question. If the Prime Minister's not able to get these planes in the air this year, that's a problem.
All right, how many of you think that a single person will be deported to Rwanda this year?
No. And it'll cost millions as well.
But more to the point, I mean, even if one was, so what? The BBC were interviewing some refugees on the Bulgarian-Turkish border. I heard the interview. It was absolutely heartbreaking. These people were desperate. The idea that someone comes along and says, oh, by the way, you might end up in a hotel in Rwanda, I mean, they would say, well, I'll take the risk.
Yeah.
But how absurd to think that success would actually be one person going. I mean, even if it's wildly successful, by the government's own estimation, it might be a couple of hundred people. I mean, to answer your question, Iain, about why the government doing this, for me, I think it's quite simple. The vast majority of the public, and all the polling shows this, care about the state of our NHS and the cost of living crisis. And the government seems to have messed up on both of those issues so badly that all they've got left is to sort of whip up hate and division by pushing through this bill.
Right. Well, that was a good start to the programme. We'll move on to tax cuts next, but not for a couple of minutes. It's 8:15.
Weekdays from 7 a.m.
That's 14 years ago, Secretary of State.
Straight to the point.
Well, these are your candidates who totally disagree with you.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast on LBC.
People would rather go to the dentist than vote Conservative.
Listen on your radio and Global Player, the official LBC app.
19 minutes past 8. Daisy Cooper, the Lib Dem deputy leader, is here, as is Sir Robert Buckland, former Justice Secretary, Sir Simon Jenkins, columnist for The Guardian, and human rights barrister Charlotte Proudman. Before we go on to our next call, we've had a couple of texters, Jay in Milton Keynes and Jamie in York. They've both texted to ask if Sir Ed Davey should resign over the post office scandal. Daisy, what do you think?
No, of course he shouldn't. No, he absolutely shouldn't. Like, Ed has said very clearly that he deeply regrets what has happened. He obviously met Alan Bates when he was a minister. He
refused to, first of all, though, didn't he?
He was 11 days into the job, and a few months in, he was asking questions and then did meet with Alan Bates, and he put Alan Bates's questions to the Post Office and got responses. I think all postal affairs ministers over the last 20 years or so will, have questions to answer when they're quizzed in the inquiry. But Ed himself has, championed the cause of having an independent inquiry, putting it on a statutory footing. I know he's met with a number of sub-postmasters, and he, like the rest of us, recognises
but he's
the
got
devastating
one in his
miscarriage of
constituency
justice.
who's going to stand against him because she thinks he behaved badly.
She is known as a political campaigner in that particular constituency.
So I sense you choosing your words carefully here.
I'm choosing my words carefully. She is known as a political campaigner in that particular constituency. I know that she has been associated with some very divisive political campaigning in that particular constituency. Ed is incredibly popular, and I hope very much that people in his constituency return him at the next election.
Anybody else got anything to say about this, or should we move on?
I think it's a good... Everybody now who makes a mistake has to resign.
Yes, but Ed Davey has called for people to resign on 34 different occasions.
That is his fault. He's an idiot. But he doesn't have to... for everything we've ever done wrong in life, it means we have to stop doing our job we're doing. It's completely... It's become a kind of cliche now.
OK. Right, let's move on to Robbie in Chelmsford. Hello, Robbie.
Evening all. My question is, recent polling from the Times showed that every voter demographic had prioritised better funded public services ahead of tax cuts. However, the government continues to trail that tax cuts are their priority. If you all had a tenner of fiscal headroom, how would you split it between public services and tax cuts?
Let's say 10 billion. Simon Jenkins.
I mean, it's very interesting. Traditionally, a Tory party wins by promising to cut taxes, and this kind of ideology is stuck in the political complexion. It's the same on the left; they have the same problems. But it's clear from every opinion poll now, people want public money to be spent on public services, and when the public services are not working, they want more money spent on them. And that there's never been a day like today when public services need more money spent on them. And I'm very surprised that the Chancellor is going on crazily saying he's going to do it. What happens now if he doesn't do it? It's bad politics. The budgets used to be secret.
But do you think if this wasn't an election year and he was doing this budget, that he would be promising tax cuts?
No. No, I mean, he's human. But no, I mean, I think that at a time when it's clear that the state in some important sense is failing at the moment, and everybody ought to be, and I think the opposition as well, ought to be gathering around and saying, look, we've got serious problems in about 4 or 5 major public services. What are we going to do about it? One thing you don't do is say, well, we haven't any money.
It was very interesting. On this programme last week, we had a Conservative MP, Craig Tracy, and I can't remember what question he was asked, but I then followed it up and said, well, can you name one public service which is better now than it was 14 years ago? And it was a bit of a sort of gulping like a goldfish moment. Now, we didn't put that out as a viral clip, which was a big mistake, because the TUC then did, and it got, I think, 2 million hits.
There's one.
And you think, well, that shows that anecdotally, it shows that there are a lot of people out there that really that resonated with, because there is this feeling that public services don't work. Now, Daisy, if you were Lib Dem Shadow Chancellor, just imagine what a pleasurable job that would be. And you had £10 billion that you thought that you weren't expecting to have, where would you put that money?
Yeah, I would say probably the vast majority of it we would invest in public services, and a large part of that would go into health and social care and education. So I'm the health and social care spokesperson for the Lib Dems. I'm not the Shadow Chancellor, but health and social care will be at the heart of our manifesto. It's going to be our most ambitious area, and it will attract the largest spending commitments for us as we go into the next general election. More broadly on that point, when I've been knocking on doors for 15 years as an activist, and you used to knock on a door and say, "Oh, hello, I'm from the Liberal Democrats, is there anything I can help you with?" And people would talk about a pothole, or maybe they couldn't access a service. They'd name a single thing, 2 or 3 things. And now when I knock on doors and say, "Is there anything I can help you with?" people say, "What? Everything? Everything?" And you say, "Well, do you want to unpack that a little bit?" And they say, "Well, everything's broken. You can't get childcare around here. You can't see a GP. I can't get a dentist. The train is delayed. Nothing works."
And do they blame you for that as the MP?
No, they don't blame me as the MP. They blame the government. They blame the government. And they're just really angry that nothing works. Everything is broken, and people can see that the country is on its knees. And so it's no wonder at all that people want to see investment. I think we have got to invest in our health and social care services, because it's good for people's dignity and for their well-being. But health and wealth are 2 sides of the same coin. And if you don't invest in the health of your population, you are not going to have a functioning economy. And that's where we are at the moment.
We did a phone-in last week on social care. Mm-hmm. And one of the experts that we had on said that they reckoned £3.5 billion would immediately solve the social care problem in this country. Now, that would mean axing a 2p cut on income tax, I think. So you would spend the money on social care and not a 2p cut on income tax?
So we have said that we will invest heavily in social care. We've announced pledges around introducing free personal care. We want to increase the minimum wage for care workers. We want to introduce a Royal College of Care Workers to make sure that there's career progression and proper pay scales in place for care workers as well. So we're very ambitious in this area. But we've been very, very clear that we will want to raise money to fund this by looking at the big sectors and the big businesses that have done incredibly well at the moment. We won't fund our pledges on health and social care by taxing struggling, hard-working families.
Robert?
Well, look, I think where we are now with so-called fiscal drag, the lack of putting up the thresholds, either the 20p or the 40 pence threshold, is that the government is yielding huge amounts of money from that. I mean, it's much more than 10 billion a year. It's a significant slug of money coming into the Treasury, which you can absolutely justify on the basis that the government spent hundreds of billions of pounds during COVID. There has to be a reckoning for all of these things. But at the same time, I think it would be a pretty hard-hearted person not to recognise the fact that on the margins of some of those tax thresholds are people who are paying huge amounts of tax. So if you're a working mum who's might be an experienced nurse paying 40% tax over £50,000 and you've got 2 kids, your child benefit goes straight back into the system. You're being taxed at a level of about 60%. Now that to me doesn't seem right. And the tax system has suffered from 2 things. One, I think, the failure to upgrade thresholds in line with inflation. But 2, this sort of historical set of anomalies that makes the system pretty incomprehensible, frankly, to most people. One of the great things we did in the 90s was actually simplify tax. When Ken Clarke was Chancellor, tax was looking a lot more, income tax was looking a lot more simpler and straightforward. I think a Conservative government should be seeking to simplify and streamline the system, not trying to offer, giveaways on a bonanza scale. But doing
that's what they're briefing they're going to do.
Well, look, I agree with Simon.
They put them up again.
I'm of the old school. I think budget. Hugh Dalton resigned leaking a budget to a lobby journalist just before he went in to deliver it. And now we're in a position where we know about the budget becomes like the sort of the non-event of the year. I'd much rather see secrecy, careful consideration, but would you rather, if he has got balanced
this money, would you rather it was spent on public services?
Look, we all see what we see in public services, and they're struggling. There's no doubt about it. But to say there's not been investment is just nonsense. I mean, the amount of money the government's put in year on year investing in public services, we never spent more on health than we have done in the last few years.
But it's always piecemeal, and it's too late, and it's in little bits.
But it's not in little bits. I mean, it's a massive slug of investment in the NHS.
Think about January last year.
And the long-term plan. But hold on, Daisy. The long-term, NHS plan that Jeremy Hunt himself announced, was a major sea change in investment in the NHS. It can't all be about money all the time. And I think, this government, I remember Tony Blair talking about the scars on his back. Unless you really look at proper reform of public services, staying true to the principle of health free at the
But that's not what budgets are about, are they?
No, but there are longer-term... And, of course, there's a longer-term issue about the tax base itself and how we are having a shrunken tax base to pay for an ever larger public sector.
Charlotte Proudman.
Well, I mean, I think that people do want more money to be invested in their public services because they are broken. We've had so many strikes. We've had the teachers' strike, the doctors' strike. We've even had barristers' strikes, railway strikes, and, not wanting to moan too much about the court system, Iain, but I mean,
you're going to anyway.
The backlog of the court system is absolutely enormous. Cases are running on for years. There are more litigants in person in court than ever because of cuts to legal aid, which really have hit deep some years later. And that means then that court time is occupied, judges that are having to deal with two litigants in person, often in really desperate situations, particularly in the family courts where children are at the heart of that. And you look at the criminal courts where survivors of rape have spoken.
Slightly going off the subject.
I mean,
you got £10 billion. What are you going to spend it on?
I think that health and social care has to be an absolute priority, looking at how particularly awful it is for those that are reliant on care when leaving hospital, especially in acute circumstances, which is, sometimes assigned to social workers for vulnerable adults. Other times that care just instantly drops off and there just isn't anybody to help them, which then means often they're back in hospital. It's a recurrent problem. It's costing huge amounts of money. It's not economically viable. And then, of course, there's the pain and mental health trauma that goes along with that for the individual and also their family. To me, it's just storing up problems that in a decade time, the NHS is going to be demolished.
So no tax cuts, put it all into health and social care.
I mean, I think that should be a priority along with education and particularly the court system. Okay. It's on its knees.
You've made that clear. Right, we'll come on to different subjects in just a moment here on Cross Question. It's 8:30, time for the LBC News headlines with Charlotte Morgan.
The Prime Minister's controversial Rwanda deportation bill has suffered a setback after peers in the House of Lords voted to delay it. Last week, Rishi Sunak had urged them not to frustrate the will of the people. LBC's been told at least 24,000 homes are without power as a result of Storm Isha. At least 2 people have died following strong winds. And Downing Street has suggested it would not support scrapping Post on Saturdays. Ofcom is looking at options to reform Royal Mail to make the service more sustainable. LBC weather, showers continuing over the far north of England and northwestern Scotland. Mostly dry and clear elsewhere with an overnight low of 2.
This is LBC.
8:34, Daisy Cooper, Sir Robert Buckland, Sir Simon Jenkins and Charlotte Proudman with us answering your questions. Right, here's a text question from Peter in Hampstead. Is the National Trust too woke, or is this just a desperate Tory line? Now, the background to this is that Sir Keir Starmer today attacked the Conservatives for waging war on organisations such as the National Trust, the RNLI, and anti-poverty charity, the Trussell Trust, saying Tory rhetoric has helped demonise them. Now, do I remember, Simon, that you used to chair the National Trust?
Yes, you're right.
Are you responsible for all this wokery?
Just after my time, as people always say.
But there have been a few, I'm trying to think what the examples are, but there have been a few examples of them, shall we say, indulging in a little bit of work.
Well, two things. I could go on at length on this. One is that there was a lot of pressure 10 years ago, 8 years ago, on all these organisations to look again at the way in which they interpret their own history and the British history. And I've got a certain sympathy with the view that they should look askance at what might be called the traditional way of doing it. And I remember when the National Trust never mentioned the fact that many of their houses were owned by gays. And I thought that was wrong. And if you got T. Lawrence's cottage...
Somebody actually said never mention that.
Yeah. And a lot of the families who left properties to the Trust did not want this mentioned at all. It's great sensitivities. Also, the National Trust has got more than 5 million members now. It's almost sort of 1 in 5 of the population. And you cannot pretend that those people are going to agree on anything. The only thing you can do, and I found this when I was there, whatever the issue was, just calm it down. Accept that people disagree on fox hunting, badger hunting, whatever it might be, and you just sort of see your way through it in an easy way as possible. The National Trust undoubtedly came adrift about colonialism or decolonisation, very briefly and not finally. They had a study done which they didn't actually fully implement, but they got absolutely roasted for it. But not widely, I have to say, loudly, but not widely. And the reason is that on almost any issue you're going to find 10% of the membership who feel very strongly about it. The wonderful thing about the Trust to me is it is basically about the past. It is about how you interpret the past, how you present the past. It's about making people feel happy with their past and with their country and with their countryside and so on. And trying not to steer into endless blind alleys as a result of doing it.
But what a great job.
It was a marvellous job, I have to say. I'm very devoted to it, really.
Charlotte?
I grew up in the Peak District, so you can imagine lots of National Trust properties and things to roam around on, and delightful place it is. But I mean, I don't really understand how it is that we've ended up with the Trussell Trust being demonised.
No, I mean, I just think that it's a saintly organisation that no one could possibly criticise.
How have we arrived at this situation where campaigning against poverty ends up meaning you're woke?
I have to say, I haven't come across the examples of their wokery, but...
I mean, even the National Trust, how is it they've been demonised to this extent? I mean, any work they're doing on decolonisation surely is nothing but a positive. And, I think it's ironic that so many Conservatives talk about freedom of speech, freedom of expression, able to share your opinion, able to critique things. And yet when it comes to critiquing colonisation or anti-poverty, somehow you're woke. It's one rule for one and another for everybody else.
We had to be careful about what we mean by criticism. I mean, the social media now is just a nightmare. If someone simply organises some sort of storm, or whatever it might be, suddenly they're under attack. And anybody can say anything and someone's going to object to it. We have no way of measuring the way people react. We assume that the reaction is wholly negative if enough noise is made on a particular issue. And I don't know what we do about it, because it's uncontrolled, it's unreliable, it's mendacious often. You have no way of saying, I appreciate not everyone agrees with me, but I think they're a minority, because there's no such thing as a minority on social media.
No, I mean, there is a real herd mentality, I think, on social media. I think that's right. But, I mean, social media is also very good, though, isn't it, in terms of raising awareness of different political issues and reaching a wider
that word,
audience.
raising awareness.
I think
really
it is. I mean, I, as clients and other people who do learn a lot from social media, and we do also get cutting-edge news updates from social media. I think there's a lot to be said about the value of it.
Yeah, I mean, it is the equivalent of a megaphone, though, isn't it, sometimes? And, one person with a megaphone is one person with a megaphone. I always say use it as a telephone, not a megaphone. Let's have a proper conversation rather than being shouted at. But I have to say, I found Keir Starmer's speech a bit odd. I can't think of any Conservative minister or MP who's criticised the RNLI. Nigel Farage did, but he's not a Conservative. And the same with the National Trust.
Yet.
Most of the members of the Conservative Party, my members, will be members of the National Trust and supporters of the RNLI. In fact, a lot of Conservative members will also have other charitable activities supporting organisations like that. So I'm sorry, I really do not recognise.
But they are the very people.
They are the very people. He set up Aunt Sally's here.
They're the very people who would complain about what Simon was talking about the sort of decolonisation education initiative for the National Trust.
I don't have look. The National Trust is one of those huge institutions of the nation, millions of members, that is at its best when it is relaxed, warm, and happy. Where things go wrong, it's the same with the BBC, is where people start to get too portentous about everything and think that every word they utter is somehow, some sort of holy writ. It's not. Simon's point about staying calm, I think, is a really powerful one. Let's all stay calm. Let's take the work of conservation seriously, but stop taking ourselves too seriously. But I have to say, I found Keir's attack today weird. I do not recognise that in the Conservative Party that I've been a member of for 40 years, one iota, and I think he's setting up some sort of culture war of his own, which doesn't bear any relation to the Conservative Party that I'm a member of.
I mean, when you talk to people about the things that they're most proud of in our recent history, they see things like, the 2012 Olympics, right? We love that. We love the Olympics. The pandemic was awful, but the clapping together on the Thursday night for our key workers was something that brought us all together. Strictly Come Dancing is something else where there's a kind of national conversation. And I do think there's a real hunger in sort of the British population for politics to bring us together. And actually, there are politicians, whatever, despite what Robert says, there are politicians who are trying to peddle these kind of fake kind of culture wars, these phony culture wars, to divide people and to stoke up sort of hate and division in order to win votes, rather than putting the country first and putting forward a vision that could unite people around a shared future. I think that's really sad.
But isn't there a problem, though, that there are some people who are trying to essentially tear down a lot of our national heroes because they look at them through the prism of today? I mean, take Nelson as one. There was an article in The Spectator this week about how apparently, I can't remember all the details, but I mean, he is considered, certainly by people in Norfolk, to be one of our country's biggest heroes. And yet, because he may have been involved in some sort of activity that we would judge harshly today, therefore, all the statues should be ripped down.
Well, I'm a Suffolk girl, so I've got quite a lot to say about Nelson. But I think the thing about history, and I'm not a historian, but the thing about history is it constantly changes. If history was static, you wouldn't have historians. Historians are constantly reinterpreting and adding to the history of what they know, and that's part of the joy of historians. They're always finding out new things. And I think it's entirely possible to say about somebody who's had an important role in our history, this person was a remarkable individual for achieving A, B and C. And in more recent years, we've discovered that they also were involved in A, B and C. This was a complicated era. This was the acceptable norms of the time. This is how people now see these particular norms. It's possible to have that sort of nuanced perspective. And there are debates to be had about statues and whether they should still be in a public, whichever statue it might be, whether a statue should remain in a public place because it's still an important part of our history, or whether they go into museums. But I think it's possible to have that discussion. And I feel like as a country, we've lost the art of being able to agree to disagree agreeably.
Well, take the point about Rule Britannia. A young cellist saying that he felt uncomfortable with Rule Britannia being played because he thought it had associations with slavery.
We should read the lyrics, shouldn't
we?
The
history of Rule Britannia is that it was a political song written by opponents of George II who didn't want him to concentrate on Europe as a policy, but wanted him to build a bigger navy and go to the high seas. It was a political song. It was nothing to do with slavery. It was all about British power and the way that, in particular, the Prince of Wales viewed the power of Britain. And understanding the context of Rule Britannia and how it was, what it was written for, should hopefully calm everybody down and make people realise that song has really nothing to do with some of the connotations that people ascribe it to.
Just finally on this, as a daughter of Suffolk, Daisy, would you rip down Nelson's column in Trafalgar Square?
No, I wouldn't.
Goodness for that.
Who wants to?
Out.
1.1% of the population? I mean, just someone's gone on social media and raised Cain on this subject. Everybody assumes there's a massive movement. We should to topple Nelson's column. It's absolutely mad. We've got to find some way of measuring opinion.
Yeah.
I think we should stick them in museums. I think, why are we valorising...
Stick Nelson's column in a museum?
Not necessarily Nelson's column, but I mean, thinking about other statues where we've now learned and understood that they have a racist, colonialist, even sexist, patriarchal legacy, which has been deeply problematic, and they have benefited off the backs of offering impoverished people. Yeah, I don't think they should be held up and valorised in that way in the public arena. I think they should be put in a museum. I'm not saying they should be destroyed at all, but history has a place. We should go and be able to see that, remember what those people did, learn from that lesson, not walk around as if it's completely normal and commonplace. Stick these white men in a museum and let's have some statues of women up.
Okay. But, I mean, what about people like Lloyd George, for example? He was a randy old goat. He was financially corrupt, but was one of our greatest prime ministers. I mean, most people, whatever their politics are, would agree that he was a great prime minister. I mean, Churchill is another one that people delight to try and tear down nowadays. And yes, of course, he had his faults. We all know that.
Quite big faults, yeah.
But without him, we'd be sitting here conducting this conversation in German.
Yeah, but equally, as you say, now we're critiquing that. 5 years ago, would we have been critiquing him in the same way? I don't think we would.
But I'm not sure it's critiquing. I think it is actually, there is an agenda out there to tear down the reputation of people who are regarded as our national heroes.
No, I think it's recognising the fact these people are not just heroes. It's recognising what their flaws are and how sometimes they've benefited from some of the power imbalances and the ways in which, they've been able to wield their power to the disadvantage of others.
Doesn't this reflect, though, the kind of extreme nature of how public debate now operates? Because in that example, you're saying there are some people with an agenda because they want to destroy their reputations. There are other people who want to defend reputations without hearing a bad word said against them at all. There has to be a say
middle
for people
ground.
in the
Obviously,
in the
I would say that's about
It's a middle ground, but I think the younger generation, particularly Gen Z, I don't think they do have time for some of the older leaders that people like my grandparents used to say look up to and idolise. I don't think the younger generation do.
And the reason for that is because we don't have deference in our society any longer, which I think is a good thing generally.
I think that's a good thing. I agree.
But we wouldn't, even 20 or 30 years ago, would we even have had this kind of conversation? No, we wouldn't.
I think that's the point I was driving at, exactly that. I was taught up not necessarily just to show deference to someone because they're older, because they're seen as wiser in a more senior position, but instead to be able to have a conversation with them, ideally on equal terms, and to be able to challenge people if you disagree with them.
And we can do that with 2 Knights of the Realm in the studio, can't we? It's 8:47.
This is LBC.
Right, let's continue with your questions to Sir Robert Buckland, Sir Simon Jenkins. I think it will soon be Dame Daisy Cooper.
Oh, I hope so.
Would you accept a damehood, Charlotte? No, I don't think you would either. Right, deserve one. Let's go to Chris in Croydon. Hello, Chris.
Oh, good evening, Ian. Good evening, panel. My question is, could Keir Starmer's background as a human rights lawyer prove to be his Achilles heel?
Well, it's certainly yours, Charlotte, isn't it?
Look, I'm a human rights lawyer, loud and proud.
But you understand the point that Chris is making.
I do. We've all seen the headlines in terms of some of the people that Keir Starmer has represented. And I think, it's probably a bit rich me saying this, but we shouldn't perhaps be too closely aligned with our clients. And our clients, I see Robert nodding, he likes that. I probably am quite closely aligned with some of my clients' interests because I consider myself a women's rights advocate. And I think we have a lot to do in that area of law in terms of helping to change it. But, we represent whichever brief comes across our desk. And I fundamentally believe in the cab rank rule, generally speaking.
I mean, that line that Rishi Sunak had at PMQs last week was something like, well, I kill terrorists, he invoices them. I mean, quite a powerful line.
Very powerful,
But, I mean, would he have had any choice in taking that case to defend Hizb ut-Tahrir?
No, absolutely not. If he's briefed to do that job and he is able to do so, given his skills and his experience...
Give it to Charlotte Proudman, she'd like to do that.
No, I wouldn't have the skills and experience to do that, I'm afraid. But no, he'd have to do it. And I think that's absolutely right as lawyers, that we have to do sometimes unpopular cases. I've done very unpopular cases, particularly when I was junior. Now I've built myself a niche area of practice and tend to represent victims of domestic abuse, men and women, and indeed children who suffered violence. But, equally, Keir Starmer as a human rights lawyer would have represented all sorts of people, good, bad, evil. I'm afraid that's the life of a lawyer.
And I doubt whether, I think it was 2008, wasn't it? I doubt whether at that point he ever thought he would be an MP or potential Prime Minister. So you've got... Oh, you think he did?
I don't know. I couldn't... I mean,
you look very doubtful there.
I assume not. But no, why do you ask?
Does your face give away things like that in court?
Terrible poker face.
Robert?
Well, I love this phrase, human rights lawyer. I've been a criminal barrister for 20 years before I became an MP. I dealt with human rights every day. I didn't call it that. I just called it the liberty of the individual, the common law. Everybody who gets involved in legal practice will at some point be dealing with people's rights. But there is a point here. I think if you get a sort of subset of my colleagues who sort of hold themselves out as somehow, not necessarily having a specialist, of course that's important, but who let themselves get into a position where they are seen as identifying with the cause or with the client, I think that is a mistake. Charlotte is absolutely right to talk about the cab rank rule. That means, like any taxi, we have to take the fare that we are given. And over the years, I've prosecuted a lot of horrible people. I've defended a lot of horrible people. But it's not my job to judge them. My job, like Charlotte's, is to try and make sure that there is a fair trial process and that the rule of law is observed. We are ministers of justice, if you like, doing that job. And I don't make any apology about it at all. I think it's one of the most important services you can provide in this country. It's inevitable, I think, that when you get to the top of politics, you're going to start to get the sort of scrutiny that Keir is getting. However, I do depart from this idea that just because he might have, in the course of his career, represented somebody none of us like very much, that therefore that makes him a bit of a dodgy character. I think that's wrong. I think it's totally ridiculous. When I was Lord Chancellor, made it very clear that some of the rhetoric on lefty lawyers was going too far for my taste. When I practice at the bar, and in my legal practice now, I leave my political allegiance at the door of the robing room of the court. It's got nothing to do with my work in court. I wouldn't dream of talking party politics to the judge or to the jury or to anybody who was in that arena. And I think that point, all my colleagues at the bar and the solicitor's profession, everybody would do well to remember that. Leave your politics.
So when you said to Boris Johnson, I don't like you talking about lefty lawyers like you do, what did he say?
Well, he did what he did, and he said what he said, as did a few other of my colleagues. But he knew my views, and Cabinet, if I felt that there was a moment, and there were a few moments, when people went beyond what I would regard as appropriate and attacked the motivation of judges in particular, I weighed in. And I weighed in public as well to defend the integrity of the judiciary. That's the job of the Lord Chancellor.
Okay.
I think the issue here is about a political strategy, and I think it's going to backfire, because the more Rishi Sunak criticises his opponents, he's actually highlighting the fact, whatever you think of Keir Starmer and his policies or views on anything at all, he's highlighting the fact that the leader of the opposition is a very experienced and very high-ranking lawyer in this country, and it will soon come to questions about, what experience Rishi Sunak has to do his job. And I think the British public have already come to their conclusion that he's weak and inexperienced and hasn't got a clue what he's doing. So I think he should be careful in raising this as a political strategy.
Simon?
Well, it depends what we're talking about. I mean, it is becoming very, very difficult.
Well, is it Keir Starmer's Achilles heel?
No, I don't, and nor should it be, for the reasons we've been given. I've got a problem with lawyers. I mean, I've had so many arguments.
Two of us here.
I'm a journalist. I'm paid to tell the truth, to reveal the truth, to say what happened, and to get it as right as possible. You're paid to try and get your guy off, or to try and get him on. You're not about the truth. You're about defending him or attacking him or her. That was not an argument I won. Don't worry.
No,
but I mean, it was an interesting, if you like.
But it's not wrong, is it? Because you were defending people you knew were guilty.
Yeah, but look, we are bound by a code of ethics. If a defender said to me, "I'm guilty, but I want you to say not guilty and get me off," I'd say, "I'm embarrassed. I can't represent you. I'm out of here. Find somebody who's going to lie for you. I'm not doing it."
I've been on a jury 3 times. And
I've always wanted to be.
It is a fascinating and ultimately depressing experience. They are not a good idea, in my view. But watching the lawyers at that thing, I thought, what are these people doing? I mean, they know they're not telling the truth. They're telling a truth. They're paid not to tell the truth. They're paid to get that person, I repeat it, off. And I totally agree, they've got to be there. It's a fundamental right to have someone to do that to you. But if you someone claims there's a superior ethical activity to what I'm doing, I just disagree.
Yeah,
but you do believe that, don't you, Charlotte?
I mean, I actually agree with Simon. I don't think what we do is somehow superior ethical activity. Far from it. And I think, I think there's a lot as well to be said about the adversarial system versus an inquisitorial system, where instead of having two sides really go hard at each other with razor-sharp cross-examination and taking every single point, having a system where instead you allow the judges or a panel to ask questions to try and reach a decision and to find the facts, instead of having, theatrical drama play out in court. So I think there are really important questions.
Can I say, I totally agree. And I by the end of these experiences, and they're unbelievably tedious thing to do, I mean, the cost of the jury system is crazy. But at the end of it, I'm left thinking that the German and the French system is much better than ours.
No.
But isn't there also, the question here, though, really is about whether it's an Achilles heel for Keir Starmer. And there's a broader question about the role of MPs here. The role of MPs is to legislate. It's to make law. And if lawyers think they can't go into politics because of people that they've either defended or advocated for, that's completely bonkers.
I agree with
Absolutely bonkers. So it really shouldn't be on that basis.
Just to deal with this inquisitorial, I agree in family cases, absolutely right. Actually, in crime, I think the adversarial system does work, because it does actually encourage, counterintuitively, the need to negotiate and to compromise. It sounds strange, but believe me, in all my years doing it, it does work. And as for the jury system, it's the least worst of the systems I know. I certainly wouldn't want a case-hardened judge judging me. I'd want 12 good people.
What about in a rape case, though? Wouldn't you potentially want, like, the piloting in Scotland?
I don't agree with that.
I know, I disagree with you on this. I disagree with it. I disagree with that on Robert.
To do that.
I think that when you have a judge who's trained in rape myths, stereotypes, memory, trauma, understands all of those issues and is then having to give a full judgment as to why they've reached that decision, in contrast to random random people making decisions where they're clearly relying on tropes and stereotypes
but they're
and
not.
myths.
There's no evidence to suggest it. Cheryl Thomas and experts have looked at this. There's no evidence. You're right to raise the issues, and I've been vested in rape cases for years. I care deeply about it, but I think taking the jury out isn't the answer. We've got to
Surely
sort
we
out
should pilot it, though.
No,
this is one of those
cases where women feel they're being raped all over again, and they're having to lose their phones. They're re-traumatised. We've got to sort that out, and then more women will feel that the system's working for them, rather than.
Well, this is one of those occasions when I wish we'd taken that question a bit earlier, because I thought it was a really brilliant discussion. Thank you very much. And I might do a phone-in on juries, actually, because I don't think I ever have done.
But I've addressed hundreds of juries over the years.
Let's look at doing that in the future. Now, our fun question comes from Sammy in Bristol. Reese Witherspoon is under fire for making a frozen drink made from snow that she picked up outside her house because it's probably full of pollution. What's your food and drink creation which you're most ashamed of? Sugar on toast is mine, says Sammy. I had that as a child, sugar sandwiches, which is why I'm now diabetic. Daisy.
Well, I've got Crohn's disease, so I've got free reign to eat whatever I like, whenever I like. But I guess... Yeah, it's right. But probably the most offensive thing I do is I do like finishing over leftovers. And when you've got a little bit of curry and a bit of Italian and a little bit of something else on a plate, it's not beyond me to have 2 or 3 things together.
People vote for you?
Apparently so. Hope so, next time after saying that.
Robert.
Well, look, I'm going to sound like Theresa May walking through fields of wheat now. I like custard and cream with a pudding sometimes. I find that very satisfying. I know some people think it looks awful.
Well, it's completely normal, isn't it? What's wrong? What's so odd about that?
Well, some people find it a little gross, but I wasn't going to claim that I do anything worse.
Simon Jenkins, you can do better than that.
I'm crazy about pecan nuts. I'll have pecan nuts on anything, absolutely anything. If you put a pecan nut on,
you're not even American.
A cigarette, I'll start eating of it.
Charlotte.
Peanut butter, I think. Peanut butter on toast with slices of cucumber.
What's the point of cucumber? I mean, it's a nothing thing,
It's
isn't it?
kind of crispy, it tastes fresh, it is a bit limp at times. You want a crunchy cucumber, not something that's being a bit stale.
Well, thank you to all 4 of you. You lived up to my expectations. Simon Jenkins, Robert Buckland, Daisy Cooper and Charlotte Proudman. Now, on tomorrow's panel, we have the Politico UK journalist and podcaster Anne McElvoy, the Conservative MP and former Defence Minister Tobias Ellwood, the Daily Mirror's political editor John Stevens, and the Labour MP and International Development Select Committee Chair, Sarah Champion. So it's tomorrow at 8 o'clock. As usual, in the next hour, we're going to talk about, I think, a really, really serious subject, because healthcare workers are being told not to report women to the police if they believe that their patients may have illegally ended their own pregnancy. There's been a couple of cases that we've talked about in the past few months about this, haven't there? The Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists says that deeply traumatised women are being prosecuted following abortions. Is it right to encourage medics, to report women to the police if they've had an illegal abortion? And isn't it time that we really need a reform of our abortion laws? 0345 6060 973.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation.